Some new faces. My name is Elle. I use she, her pronouns. I am an organizer with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Welcome to the first installment of a joint project between me and Nelson Revelry, if you want to give a quick little wave, Nelson, and of RVA Rapid Transit. So two of us have come together to bring to you a little series just linking transportation and climate change and sustainable mobility in our COVID world as the particularities of this this webinar. So just so you guys have a layout of how the event is going to go, we're going to be hearing from three guest panelists. Mr. Let's see, I'll give brief little what do you call it, intros to everybody, but we have Mr. Wyatt Gordon, who got his urban planning in at the University of Hawaii, a master's in that and a bachelor's at the American University in DC. He's a policy manager at the Virginia Conservation Network. You can also find some of his editorialization on all things transit for the Virginia Mercury. Then we're going to be hearing from Ms. Karen Campblin, who is a founder and manager at ktcPLAN, which is a small women-owned boutique planning firm that is specializing in community development. And she also chairs just about everything relating to environment, EJ, and equity in the state of Virginia. So you've probably seen her face or heard her name a bunch, either at the Virginia State Conference for the NAACP, the Sierra Club, or Green New Deal Virginia Coalition. And then we have Ms. Kendra Norrell, who is the Community Engagement Coordinator at the Office of the City of Richmond, and primarily focusing right now on the RVA Green 2050 initiative. So we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge that are just waiting to share it with you. I'm gonna pause and just let Nelson, if you want to just give a brief, this is what RVA Rapid Transit does, and then we can continue forward and give you to what you all really came here to hear, which is not me talk, but these wonderful people talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nelson Reveley with RVA Rapid Transit. As many of you all know, RVA Rapid Transit is an organization dedicated to educating and advocating for regional public transportation in the Richmond metro area. And just really excited to have everybody here today to talk and learn more around the links between transportation and climate change. And I think we'll kick things over to Wyatt. Are you gonna start us off, unless you had anything else, Elle?
Wyatt, lead us boldly into the future.
Okay, take me to the slide, Stacy.
Can you see my screen?
I can, but this ain't me. Yeah, this is me. Okay, so thanks for coming out, everyone. It's always nice to be able to share these thoughts with some other folks. I'm generally just haunted by these issues all by my lonesome, so I appreciate being able to share that with y'all. My name is Wyatt Gordon. I'm a land use and transportation policy manager with Virginia Conservation Network. That means my primary job is to try and work on policy of how do we reduce our vehicle miles traveled. Stacy, could you take me to the next slide? So there's a lot of different ways to think about climate change. We usually talk about it as emissions. When it comes to transportation, though, the best way to really think about it is vehicle miles traveled. The more miles we travel, the more emissions and pollution we create. With our current transportation system, it's pretty hard to get around that reality because walking, biking, transit, all of our lowest emission ways of getting around are generally the least accessible for folks. We've had 70 years of our system creating car dependency for folks. So it's not like we can just say tomorrow we want to ban cars and then everything will be okay, because we've built an entire world for people where that structurally just isn't a reality, unfortunately. But we definitely, while we have that reality, on the other side, we really need to do something about that reality to change it. Because if you look at this cool graph, you'll see that 48% of all of our carbon dioxide emissions comes from transportation in Virginia. So half of all of our carbon pollution is specifically from the way we get around. It's also a really hard problem to solve. You see electric power generation is 29%. Last year there was the Virginia Clean Economy Act that set us on a path to zero carbon by 2045, but only in energy generation. That's kind of easy because you have to deal with a handful of big companies that control power generation. Transportation is hard because we have 8 million Virginians and we have over 8 million private combustion-based vehicles. So this is a diffuse problem, not a point problem, which is always more difficult. And I'll also just highlight 37% of our total emissions are just from personal vehicles. So when we look at what we need to change about our transportation, it's specifically that element that's the biggest problem. Next slide. Okay, so this is a picture of how we've been doing transportation planning for the last 70 years. It's not something that you enjoy really being involved in, having long commutes, stuck in traffic. It's incredibly frustrating. It's terrible for our environment. It's horrible for our health. And it doesn't create well-connected communities where people feel like they are part of something that is a little bit bigger than themselves. It just kind of leaves you trapped in your own little box. So at Virginia Conservation Network, we have a 4-prong approach of how we want to tackle reducing VMTs. Thankfully, they are ordered in most effective to least effective, and they're also ordered in cheapest to most expensive. So where we want to start is just helping people to live closer to where they want to be. Then really thinking about cleaner ways to get around, like biking, walking, rail, public transit, and then just how do we take everything else that we can't solve with those other 3 and then make it electric, so we have a better chance of swapping out. We're building more and more renewable electricity, so the more things that we electrify, the likelier we are that we're going to be using clean power to get around. Next slide. So why do we start with land use? Land use is the easiest solution because if I can help you to live just 2 miles from work instead of 20 miles from work, I've already reduced your carbon footprint from driving your Ford F-250 to work by 90%, and you're still driving the same polluting Ford F-250. It's not where we tend to go first. Land use tends to be seen as a local issue. But the reality is over the last years, we haven't really been building enough housing for folks, and especially not close to where it needs to be. So the problem, multifamily housing is currently banned in 2/3 of land, some places up to 75% in Virginia cities. So that means it's easier for you to get a permit to build a 4,000 square foot mansion than it is for you to get a permit to build a 4-plex and have apartments for folks. And that has problems for the climate, problems for our affordability crisis, and also problems for integration, social justice, economic justice, racial justice. So it goes beyond the climate, but the climate is really our perspective today. The solution is pretty easy. Let's just build more housing and different types of it. Accessory dwelling units, this is just a fancy word for like an in-law suite or a granny suite. Just creating more options, inclusionary housing, making sure in new developments that there's like 10 to 20% set aside for affordability so that we're getting a good mix of people in neighborhoods. Transit-oriented development is just a fancy term for a super smart way that we've kind of always built for centuries, is that if there's a really convenient streetcar or bus or train line to get downtown, let's build more housing there because that is a desirable place to be because it creates convenience for you. At the end of the day, you know, people don't want to travel more than a half an hour to get to and from work, but they don't really care if they're hopping in a streetcar or a bus or their own private vehicle. So it's really about like creating a system in which cleaner and greener ways to get around is more convenient. Next slide. Walking and biking. The biggest problem here is that we just don't have spaces where people feel safe. Generally, 20% of people are crazy like me and they're willing to bike in traffic. 20% of people would say, hell no, I'm never biking because it doesn't work for me. But then you have 60% of people that actually would love to bike if they didn't feel like they were going to be run over by a Tahoe SUV at any given moment, or have someone yell at them. And that's why separated, dedicated infrastructure is super important. So we can build wonderful amenities like the W&O&D Trail up in Northern Virginia, the Virginia Capitol Trail, or the Fall Line here in Richmond. There's a bunch of potential things that we could be building, but we've generally been spending all of our money on highways instead. So the way to really fix this is to switch the way we're funding stuff and to dedicate more funding to building out sidewalks, protected bike lanes, trails. So walking and biking infrastructure is generally super cheap compared to highways. You know, like building an entire 50-mile Fall Line trail is expected to be like 25 million, whereas doing 2 miles of bridge work on the Hampton Bay Bridge is $4.6 billion. So we're not talking about a ton of money. We just need to spend the money that we have wiser. Next slide. So our problem with rail and transit, only 3% of trips in Virginia are taken with public transportation. That is really, really low. The flip side of that is that this is really low-hanging fruit. We've seen for transit here in Richmond, about 2/3 to 3/4 of riders are still using the bus to get around. No outbreaks have been connected to public transportation in the entire country. So we can say this is a safe way to get around. It's a clean, easy way to get around. The biggest problem is transit funding. You've probably seen a lot of transit systems are facing a financial collapse if Congress doesn't do anything. In Virginia, even pre-pandemic, we had 2 of the worst funded transit systems in the country per capita, GRTC here in Metro Richmond, and also HRT and Hampton Roads. So it's kind of like with transit is the situation with schools where you're like, oh, wow, the school is underperforming. We should cut funding because it's not doing that well. That makes absolutely no sense. And it's the same way for transit. We need to really be making sure that we're putting transit at parity with highway spending, which is currently 80%, and transit is only about 20%, both at the federal and roughly at the state level. And they're just basic things that we need to be doing to make transit a competitive, convenient, and comfortable option for folks, like making sure stops have benches and shelters, making sure every bus has GPS tracking. So when you check the app to see where your bus is, you actually know your bus is coming and you can rely upon that. And then just integrated payment. So it's a quick swipe of your credit card or a tap of a transit card and you're on the bus and you don't have to worry about change. Next slide. Okay, and then our final option, once we've tried everything else, is to electrify. We only have like less than 2% of all vehicles in Virginia are electric right now, so we definitely need to ramp that up. In terms of transportation electrification, people always want to go straight to private vehicles, and that's important. As we know, that's 37% of our emissions we mentioned earlier is just private vehicles. However, transportation electrification takes in a lot of stuff. We need to be electrifying school buses, transit buses, municipal fleets. We can electrify people's e-bikes. There's a lot of things that we can be doing, to help transportation electrification. And all too often we tend to think of electrification as the first thing that we should be doing as a society, when actually the reality is that electric vehicles are cleaner, but they're not perfect. So we want to be sure that we're doing things from the most effective and the easiest to the hardest things to do. And it's really easy to change our zoning, and it costs us nothing. Biking and walking infrastructure is relatively cheap. It's very, very popular, so it's generally an easy lift. Transit funding, it can be difficult to come up with all the solutions that we need, but transit funding is one of those places where we can just throw money at the problem, and that actually is helpful. A lot of other places we need to be smarter about what we do, and with transit you literally can just throw dollars at it and it's always good. Just for the simple fact that, like, Canadian cities on average outspend us on transit 2 to 3 times. In Europe they're spending about 4 to 5 times as much. So this really is just a money problem on transit. And with electrification, it's hard because you have 8 million people you have to convince to switch to electric vehicles. And then if you want to try and use rebates to subsidize that decision, then you're looking at $5,000 times 8 million, which is money that we just don't have and we should probably be spending on other things. So I generally try and tell people, like, when we're trying to solve the issue of carbon pollution and transportation, you've got to take an improv approach and always do yes and. So yes, we need to do land use, and we need to make it easier to walk and bike. Yes, we need to do public transit, and we need to electrify all of our transit buses and other vehicles. So when there's a garbage fire, you should always try and put it out with as many ways possible. And that's generally where we are with transportation and the climate right now. So next slide, and I believe final slide. Yes, so thank you very much. You can contact me at wyatt@vcnva.org. I can get you connected to some of our great partners, like RVA Rapid Transit, CCAN. We have a bunch of really engaged folks that are all trying to shift the narrative around these issues. So we would love for you to be involved and help us to do that, because it really is an all hands on deck situation. So thank you.
Thanks, Wyatt. I guess I'll just go and just start in. Hi, my name is Karen Campblin, and Elle, I want to say thank you for your kind words and introduction. And Stacy, thank you for your support on these slides. You don't know how important it is today. I'm having really bad bandwidth and computer problems today. So if you see me shut down my video feed, please don't take it personally. It's just that I'm noticing my bandwidth is getting really wonky and everybody's freezing up on me. So just be aware of that, but I'll try and keep it on as much as I can. And so just as a continuation to what Wyatt said, this is a time for us to really reimagine and change that narrative, change the script of what transportation is to our society, what role it takes. And in order for us to be able to do that, we need to take a step back and understand what was transportation and what are the steps that got us to where we are today. Transportation, typically, I work in the planning field, and transportation is one of the focuses that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. And reading some of the engineering manuals from the past, they looked at transportation as an opportunity to move goods and people from one place to another. And that was it. It was a very one-dimensional approach. We need to get people and goods to where they need to go as fast as we can. And whatever stands in our way to make that path slower, forget about it. We really don't care. And typically it was the Black and Brown communities that were at the brunt of the removal of barriers to faster and, in their minds, more efficient transportation. So that's another thing that we need to rewrite, the wrongs in how transportation has disrupted our communities and has placed a lot of and very disproportionate negative impacts on these communities with absolutely zero health or economic benefits. So imagine, if you will, this is another way of looking at how public transit and public transportation and the provision of alternative transportation options can help not only combat climate change by taking vehicles off the road and reducing the reliance on cars, but a way in which we can develop a healthier community by walking, by encouraging active transportation, and a way in which our vulnerable communities, such as our vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, will be able around. And it also serves as a way to combat social isolation. And so next slide, please. So as I said, historically, transportation planning decisions and infrastructure development has systematically created an equitable transportation system that imposes a heavy burden on the Black community and the Brown communities and low-income communities throughout throughout Virginia and quite frankly, throughout the nation. And public transportation is a longstanding civil rights issue, and we must be committed to providing necessary public transportation services to all. That's access to clean, affordable, and efficient transportation. All of these can help to determine the socioeconomic advancement of a community and or individual, as well as accessibility to meaningful employment, medical services, and everything, places to play and the like. So let's break it down just a little bit. What is accessibility? And that is the way people are able to get from one location to another. So public transportation is a way in which we can increase mobility options. And so when I say that, I'm not just talking about buses, but I'm also talking about the ability for an individual to walk from their home to a local neighborhood store without having to battle the a very aggressive high-speed roadway, or a child to be able to bike or walk to school and not rely on their parents to drive them only 1.5 miles to 2 miles away. Or the ability for a college student to be able to go to a place of higher education. I have worked in communities in South Carolina and throughout Virginia in which there isn't even a transportation or bus stop within 5 to 10 miles of their home. And so that severely limits the opportunities for advancement, socioeconomic advancement for those communities. Next slide, please. And so transportation, as I said, has a very sordid past as it pertains to Black and Brown and low-income communities. And there's significant inequity effects of being closely or residing close to major transportation infrastructure, such as these highways. I'm sure everybody remember as we were building the national highway system, which was in and of itself a really good idea. However, these highways were purposely and deliberately constructed to either go within close proximity and quite frankly through Black communities. And through these decades, these communities have been burdened with the air pollutions that are being emitted from these infrastructure. The Virginia Clinicians for Climate Change recently conducted an assessment of the health burdens of the ambient particulate concentrations in Virginia due to these transportation systems, and has identified that there are major concentration points around Virginia that are suffering from higher cases of cancers, respiratory illnesses, high blood pressure, and quite frankly, in children, obesity, because they're unable to go outside to play, or it's not healthy for them to walk to their school because of the air pollutants. NAACP National also, although not transportation related, but they released a report called Fumes Across the Fence Line, which looked at the health effects that are imposed upon African-American communities that are located within close proximity to fossil fuel infrastructure, whether it be pipelines, factories, and the like. And they identified that school children miss on average 101,000 school days per year due to asthma and respiratory illnesses. And so if we look at it in that lens, we see that these polluting infrastructure not only has an ill effect on the environment, but such a horrible effect on our health and the social wealth of communities. These sick days are equated into, another way to look at these sick days are placing these children at an academic disadvantage at such an early age. Next slide, please. And then what we're all experiencing today, not in the same level, but we're all experiencing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also anticipating that if things don't really change, if things don't really change and gets on a better path, that we will be experiencing some kind of climactic event such as this in the future, and hope and some experts are predicting in more frequency and severity. But let's just focus on the COVID-19 at hand, because this is what we have firsthand experience about. And this is, again, another opportunity for us to really look at how important transportation is to our society, and how, if we did not have transportation, how our society would have collapsed without the ability to transport our frontline workers and our emergency workers and our essential workers to the places they need to be when everything else was shut down. Due to the short span of this, I won't get into the transport or the aviation aspects of the transportation that was impacted by the COVID-19, but I'll just focus on the disparities and the disparities that were felt. And so what the COVID-19 showed us that there are two different societies, right? Those that were able to telework were employees of industries and sectors that allowed for their employees to stay at home. And those are generally professional services, communications, or more high income earning individuals. Service and hospitality related frontline or essential bus and transit workers and low income earners were typically in jobs in which they needed to be in the brick and mortar type establishments, and to have a front-facing, public-facing interaction at all times throughout the day. And as we were developing our COVID-19 protocols, we saw how much at risk our frontline communities were, because we were unable to roll out the necessary equipments for PPE. The transit agencies were able to do some really quick fixes, such as the rear boarding in order to help protect the drivers, and as well as implementing free fare system. But these are, as the agencies are looking at it, temporary solutions. And this is something that we cannot allow to go back to the way things were, as we develop and try to modernize our transit system, as well as our bus amenities. We really need to take into significant and serious consideration that these transportation facilities are also a means in which we can protect our riders and our workers. And we really need to think of those elements as we modernize and upgrade our buses, our rail, and our transportation hubs and roadside bus elements. So before I move on, I just wanted to talk about one little thing, a survey that is currently being done by the Virginia Department of Transportation and in partnership with the Rail and Public Transportation. They're doing a survey right now. They've conducted phase 1 and phase 2 of the survey, but only the results of the first phase of the survey has been released. And they have not released the schedule for when the subsequent surveys are going to be conducted. But some of it's really interesting that some of the results that they have received from this. So according to so I think they surveyed over close to 2,000 people. And of course, the results, the respondents were people in a higher income bracket, and the results indicated that 13% of the respondents worked from home before COVID-19, but there was a significant increase by about 3-time increase of that. And oh, okay, and 60% of those who are working from home don't know when they were going to be returning back to the office, but they do anticipate that they will be able to stay at home for at least 1 day a week from teleworking. If it's a very interactive survey, and you're able to identify different criterias, and the lower the income bracket, the less likely the individual was able to telework or anticipate being able to telework into the future after the whole pandemic is resolved and everyone is able to move around in a more safer capacity. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these. I think I took a little bit more time on these three slides. So what we use at NAACP is we look at an equity lens to make sure that things are done in an equity manner. So as we're talking about transportation, these are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. What is the governance and procedural equity? How are decisions being made? Who is at the table? Who's providing input? And who's making decisions? We need to make sure that these decisions are community-based and it involves the people, the transit rider, the ADA community, the communities that really rely on the transportation system. Next slide, please. Another thing that we can look at is how is resources being invested? Right now, the current trend is most of the transportation dollars are going to the auto, roads, and are more auto-centric. And we're seeing that that is not the way to go, not only for combating climate change, but in correcting the injustices and inequities of the past. So we really need to look at what is it that people need? How are they going to access the amenities? And to make sure that there's infrastructure to support these transportation demands. How do we increase usability, not just for the more affluent riders, but how do we get the transit-dependent riders onto these systems and to get them where they need to go with meaningful impact? Next slide, please. And then finally, what are the equitable outcomes? What are the indirect consequences of placing a transportation system in an area? What are the cumulative impacts it's going to be introduced into the community? What happened in the past of that community that still needs to be resolved before we put in a transportation system? These are all the things that we need to be thinking of as we're moving forward, as we reimagine and rewrite the narrative of what transportation is in Virginia. And most importantly, who proposed the project and why? And we really need to understand what the purpose and the need and whether it's an expansion of transportation, where the funding is going to come from, and those types of questions. Next slide, please. And then we have restorative, intentional, and transformational change. If we do all of those three things and more, don't get me wrong, this is a very bird's eye view of what I discuss. It's a lot more complicated than that, but we have to make sure that the decisions we make from this point forward create affordable options that everybody's able to have access to. It better connects all neighborhoods to critical areas. And like I mentioned before, equal representation during the decision-making process, as well as, most importantly, community-based solutions. We can no longer develop transit and transportation solutions without bringing everyone to the table, and most importantly, transit riders and ADA. And so with that, I am going to pass this over to Kendra, and I look forward to talking to everyone during our question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, I think. Yeah, good afternoon. So I love coming in after the equity conversation because I'm going to talk about RVA Green 2050, which is the City of Richmond's Equitable Climate Action Plan. Next slide, please. So what RVA Green 2050 is working to achieve is a climate action plan that centers equity, but is also achieving our climate action and climate resilience goals by 2050 for the City of Richmond moving forward. So we have, we are currently in the process. We started our planning process in October. So it's pretty new to getting what we want out of this planning process, and what we've made it to at this point is developing out what our vision statement's going to look like and what we are going to use for our equity framework to make sure that while we are meeting our climate action resilience goals, we're still centering equity in the process and making sure we're meeting community priorities moving forward. Next slide, please. So for the City of Richmond, transportation is our third largest emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And so building energy being number one for the City of Richmond, but I kind of wanted to show this to kind of bring into perspective where the city in and of itself stands for emissions. And we have in our planning process 5 different working groups with technical experts, and one of our working groups is transportation. So we will be focusing specifically on transportation with our climate action planning process and coming up with objectives, goals, and strategies to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the City of Richmond by 2050. We're working in 5-year increments. So this will be the mapping out process for the next 5 years, but the next 5 years is not going to start until 2022, which is when we plan on finishing with this plan. Next slide, please. So the reason that we decided to bring in equity in this process, I showed the previous slide showed the greenhouse gas emissions. So we definitely need to work on climate action. We know that climate resilience is something that we're going to have to focus on. The City of Richmond is expected to have increase in temperatures, flooding, and precipitation moving forward. So we definitely want to build a more resilient community, and we want to make sure that we, in our climate action process, are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But we brought equity into this process because in the City of Richmond, there's disproportionate climate impacts across the city. And so we really want to make sure that while we are addressing the environmental concerns coming forward, but that we're also looking at where there are inequities that exist as they are right now in the city, and that we are not increasing burden across the city or on anyone specifically, and that our benefits are broadened out across the city as a whole. And so one of the things to take into consideration, there's a lot of neighborhoods in the City of Richmond that lack access to public transportation or safe walking and biking routes. And so we want to make sure that we consider this moving forward, because if we offer up the infrastructure needed, as Wyatt said in the beginning, we can really reduce the requirement that a lot of residents that we have in the City of Richmond are basically forced to drive their car because we have not provided the infrastructure for another option. Next slide. So what we did was mapped out a social vulnerability analysis. And so for this map, it's broken down by census tract. And the more purple the census tract is, the higher the vulnerability to climate change is going to be. So one of the factors that was involved in this process was transportation access in the city. And so you can see that a lot of the darker areas are where we are in neighborhoods that show up as historically underfunded across the city in a variety of analysis and many different overlays in many different maps. And so we are really focused on bringing communities from the darker areas to this planning process to make sure that we are bringing their lived experience and their lived expertise to match with our technical expertise that we have going on with our planning process. Next slide, please. So this is supposed to show, and so I can walk everyone through this. This is our planning process in a visual. In the center of our image, we have the Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Roundtable. That is where our lived expertise residents are participating in the process. And then we have community priorities. So over the summer, the office did a wide-scale engagement with a lot of community-based organizations in the South Side and East End of the city of Richmond to really assess where community priorities stood in the city of Richmond. And so we identified what community members were concerned about outside of climate change, and really internally brought those community priorities and connected them to climate change moving forward. So a lot of the ways that RVA Green 2050 is going to talk about climate change moving forward is through our community priorities that we identified through community engagement. And then on the outside, we have our 5 working groups. And so that's where our technical expertise are going to be residing in this planning process. So we have buildings and energy, community, transportation, waste, and environment. And so those are going to be the groups that are going to bring about our strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But in that process, all of that's going to filter through our Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Roundtable to make sure that we're still meeting community priorities and that we are talking about this process in a way that is relevant to the concerns and more in line with how people are talking about these things in the city of Richmond so that we can bring more people on board in our process. Next slide, please. So I mentioned community priorities, and so we're going to kind of talk about what we've heard from people in the city of Richmond. Next slide. So our community priorities, these are the 7 listed out. One of the things that we really heard a lot about is that there's a lack of engagement and communications and the ability to participate in plan implementation in the city of Richmond, and that there's a lack of accountability. So we really want to make sure that we bring that into this process also, but that also we are addressing community wealth, housing and infrastructure, housing and buildings, neighborhoods, and health and well-being. So we really want to make this the most holistic plan we can make. But in our neighborhood section, we definitely want to address access in and out of the neighborhood. And so in our transportation working group, we have a variety of technical experts that work with public transportation, biking, as well as electric vehicles. And so we're really trying to make sure we can broaden out how we are going to address this process and bring in all of the options available to us to really move forward with our plan. Next slide, please. And these are some of the survey results. And so this slide right here is to just give kind of an overview of who has responded to our survey. And you can see that a lot of the demographics within the survey do not match the demographics for the city of Richmond. And that's just something to keep in mind as we go through what's going on, or some of the feedback that I got from the survey as it stands from November 5th. So there's been new responses since then, but all of this data is going to come from November 5th. Next slide. We asked, how do you get around Richmond? And so the number one, you were able to choose all transportation modes that you use. And so 91% of the people who responded use a personal car in the city of Richmond. Walking was the next, and then bikes and public transportation. But seeing that difference in how people get around and that most people are using their personal car to do a lot of things, what we know about Richmond is that Richmond is not overly large and that it is possible, depending on where you live, to get to a lot of places by walking, biking, and public transportation. So one of the things that we have to take from this survey is kind of figure out where people live in the city and then match that to how they say they get around Richmond to really identify what we may need in different areas compared to other areas. Next slide. And then if we asked how they would allocate budget money moving forward for sustainable policies and implementation, and transportation was the number 4 allocation of money in the city of Richmond. So that comes in after affordable and sustainable housing, which makes sense. We have an affordable housing crisis in the city of Richmond, and then clean energy, and then trees and urban green spaces, which really matches up well with our urban heat island information that we've received over the past 3-4 years. Next slide. And then this is something that I think is really important for this process. About, or 94.9% of respondents are at least a little concerned with environmental justice in the city of Richmond. And so taking in all this information and focusing our climate action plan through the lens of environmental justice and racial equity is so important to address a lot of the concerns that we see. Richmond is a segregated city with a lot of inequities that are in very specific areas in the city. So really thinking that through moving forward and how we address climate is something that is the center of our focus for this entire planning process. And that includes our transportation section. I think this is the next slide is the last slide. Yes, so if you want to reach out to me, this is my email address. I love to talk to anyone about any of this information. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of those. You can also follow us on social media. We pretty much update all of those pretty frequently. So yeah, thank you.
Neat. Oh, thank all three of y'all for giving us so much information. A big round of applause, all of the emojis thrown to y'all. All right, cool. So now we're entering our question portion. So any burning desires that you have been like ruminating over, especially as this has been entering into the mainstream, you can throw them in the chat now. We're going to start with the first one here, which is directed towards Kendra, which is how is RVA Green 2050 trying to engage hard to reach stakeholders during the rest of the pandemic?
Yeah, so one of the things that we started out doing, so since our engagement process started in April, we were already in our virtual decision. So we decided to keep our engagement 100% virtual during the pandemic. And so we flipped the switch, and instead of engaging directly with residents, we moved to engaging with community-based organizations that engage with residents, which really works out well for our equity plan because we, as the city of Richmond, do not have the relationship that's needed to get the information from residents as it stands right now. But we did have connections with community-based organizations. And so we were able to take that trust that we had with organizations, either professional or personal level of trust, and be able to really gather a lot of the feedback from residents. And so currently moving forward, our next large engagement phase is in March. And so we're partnering with a couple of organizations to do some events moving forward. We have the Environmental Film Festival. We'll be participating in that, planning something for Earth Day, but really making sure that the organizations that we partner with are also are working within communities that historically have not engaged in planning processes in the city of Richmond.
Do we feel good about that answer, Bill? Awesome. I'm not sure who exactly these came from because these have been mediated through different folks, but another question, I'm assuming for everybody, what about bus transit between counties since most bus transit is county based? So I think looking at that expansion of anybody who feels compelled to speak to that.
Is that within a region? Or are you talking about like to go between cities?
Whoever asked the question is welcome to unmute and step in there.
Yes, thank you. It was a question from me, Jeffrey. I live on the border between Fairfax and Loudoun County. My job will be in Loudoun County because I live on the border. How would I get a bus between Fairfax and Loudoun County? Yes, there are buses that do go between, and fortunately we do have the metro up here. But I mean, what if I live between Henrico and Caroline or something? How would I get between those?
I'm happy to jump in. I can't say I know too much about Northern Virginia's transit landscape, except that there's like, I think a half dozen at least different agencies and providers. I think that just kind of goes to show a little bit of how we don't think about the consumer experience of people who ride transit. And when we do transit policy and transit funding, we tend to treat it like it's mobility welfare, rather than an integral service for folks to get to and from work, but also just to get around in their daily lives. You know, the bus isn't just for commuting, the bus is for people to get around every time of the day. So I can't say that I know that there are any fixes underway. One of the things that I think would be worth talking to some of your local elected officials is about how Northern Virginia could move towards one type of kind of overarching transit umbrella. You probably saw recently that there was a big report that came out about how we can start integrating Virginia Regional Express trains and Amtrak trains and MARC trains in Maryland to build a kind of overarching regional rail system around Metro DC. That's kind of the direction we need to go with transit also. We need to be thinking about, in big regions like Northern Virginia, how do we make sure that you can go from a dash bus to the metro or to transfer to a bus in a different county without having to pay an extra fee. So a lot of the times we really end up thinking about what does this mean for localities' bottom lines and how much money they're spending or not spending. And really we need a paradigm shift in thinking about what does the rider need? What does the consumer experience look like? Because for your specific situation, it's pretty obvious that that is not the lens that people have been taking to transit in your region.
All right, I know we're coming close to 1 o'clock, so I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we can send some of the questions we didn't get a chance to get to our presenters today, and get responses out to y'all as well. But one last question, it'd be great to just get kind of brief responses from all three, if you're all three game. The question is, what are the biggest obstacles to better funding for public transportation and alternative means of improved bike lanes, pedestrian infrastructure? What are the biggest barriers that you see towards increases in funding for our alternative modes of transportation? Just the bird's eye, if folks are game, as we wrap up here.
I just spoke, ladies, so I was going to let y'all have the first word.
All right, I can. So I would say one of the biggest barriers is the lack of representation of transit riders and the lack of reaching out to our elected officials to let them know that this is a priority. It should be and must be a funding priority. And as I think what we've been hearing and really identified and noticed during this lockdown is we really need to fix how transit is being operated and designed. It's kind of like it's designed to fail, except for a few routes that are intended to move people from affluent communities to their jobs in DC, and everything else is supposed to fail. So they have that fail safe to say, I don't know why we're going to add additional money to this, because look at it, the buses are empty. And you're like, well, you know, it's infrequent, it's unreliable. It doesn't take me where I need to go. And if you look at the bus stop, it's just a sign right next to a roadway where the speed limit is 55. And I can't stand there with my kids and my baby stroller. And so I have to find a different mean. And we also have to be really, really careful, because there's a lot of focus on that last mile micro transit fixes that are going on. And COVID kind of identified, you know, the revenue in rail didn't bounce back as quickly as our buses in a more localized use, and that they're almost getting to the numbers of pre-COVID, right? But they're also looking at using ride share, bike share, and all of those different things that also have unintended equity consequences that we have to be very careful to say, if we're going to utilize those types of transportation options, we need to have careful consideration to those who are unbanked, meaning they don't have a credit card, so they cannot set up an account. Those that choose to or don't have access to internet, so they don't have that call system on their phone, and those that just don't trust the service. And so we cannot move to another, we can't move away from the roads to another service that further isolates people from being able to have a reliable transportation. And then I'll just stop there. I could go on this for a while, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karen. That's fantastic. Thank you. Wyatt,
Yeah, I will add on and just say, like, be loud and be persistent. If you are a person of privilege, and I don't mean vast sums of wealth, but maybe you have some extra time, maybe you're not working 2 to 3 jobs just to put food on the table and a roof over your family. But that's the reality where a lot of transit riders are. To speak from GRTC, you know, we have 78% of our population are Black people who are riding the bus. And we have 50%, I think it's 52% of our riders are under the federal poverty limit. Another 25% are within a few $1,000s of the poverty line. So we're talking about people who are core riders who know the most about what makes the bus work and doesn't work, but they don't have the time to share their experience because they're busy. The system is already failing them in so many ways, whether it's a lack of childcare, lack of livable wages, so they have to work multiple jobs. And that's one place where you can use your voice on behalf of folks who don't have the time to use their own voice. Also, it's crazy, but as a white person in Richmond, when I tell people that I don't own a car and I only ride the bus, it gets attention because it's not something that people fits into their paradigm. Or if I go somewhere in the city where there aren't that many people that look like me and I wait at the bus stop, I notice drivers staring at me. So you can use your body and your voice as a way to say that our system needs to change and do work on behalf of folks that don't have that bandwidth because it's a pandemic and everything else, that they were already kind of overworked in their normal lives and now it's even worse. But now is the time, especially when we need elected officials at the state, local, federal level. I mean, at the federal level, 80% of our dollars are mandated to highway construction. At the state level, we're spending about 75% on highways. At the local level here in Richmond, the Central Virginia Transportation Authority is only giving 15% to transit when really we need it to be funding like 50%. And those are all different people that you can reach out to and say, this isn't enough and this isn't working for me and my community.
Thank you, Wyatt. And Kendra, did you have anything you wanted to add in or echo?
No, I think it all got covered, definitely.
Rock and roll. Well, I know we're at 1 o'clock. We're so grateful for everybody carving out time today to be with us, and we're especially grateful for all the presenters today. We're gonna send around some next steps. We'll email them out to you all. There's some events coming up. There are ways to get involved. Clearly, yeah, just want to echo the importance of speaking out and speaking up, and how critical funding and policies are to all of these pieces. Yes, we'll send out these. So see, these are some of the things coming up, equity and transit events coming up, and the NAACP. I know there are lots of ways to get involved with RVA Green 2050. We've got another webinar Elle and I are working on coming up January 7th around housing and TOD, so that importance of land use, and highlighting those links between transportation and climate change. And then CCAN's got a Transportation Lobby Day coming up on January 28th. So yes, we'll get all that information out to you all. And I know there are a few questions as well that we didn't get a chance to get to, that we'll try to get to our presenters and get answers to as well. If 3 cheers. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of Monday.
Thank y'all so much for joining us.